Story 1. I teach preschool to children around 3 to 4 years old. One day, a girl started scratching herself because she made a mistake. I don't remember the exact incident, but I believe she forgot something and needed to retrieve it from her cubby. What I do remember is that she was crying intensely, and I had to stop her from scratching. Then, she began to bite herself. She was a perfectionist, so any mistake would send her into a frenzy. By the end of the year, she stopped hurting herself during these moments and seemed a bit more at ease with making mistakes, although she would still shut down from time to time. However, she is doing much better now. Story 2. When our new school was built, the children went wild. We are in a 10-story building, and there were no screens or grills on the windows. Several teachers left their classrooms open with students inside. More than once, as I passed by a classroom on the 9th floor, I found students dangling their friends from the window. I seriously considered quitting because it was so stressful for me. Thankfully, the behaviors mostly stopped after the first couple of years. It has been almost 15 years. They finally blocked the windows after a child in a different school jumped. Story 3. I worked in a school a few years ago where a 5-year-old attacked a staff member walking with him in the hallway, resulting in a concussion that left her in a wheelchair and unable to speak. She may have a lifelong disability because the school misidentified the child as having only speech needs, even though he had been performing parkour in classrooms and swearing at teachers for 2 years. Story 4. During a code red drill, a student refused to be quiet, and when I approached him, he grabbed a pair of scissors and poked me in the neck while laughing hysterically. Luckily, that was enough to have him removed from the classroom and take the class online since he had already been removed from other teachers' classrooms. I doubt he ever graduated and wouldn't be surprised if he is in prison now. Story 5. Some kids were running around on the staircase. One of them ran into a heavily pregnant teacher who fell and had to be taken to the hospital. She didn't come back for almost a year, at which point we learned that she had lost the baby due to the fall. Story 6. I was an after-school director similar to daycare. The day was almost over. I saw the custodian marching down the hallway, clearly upset. He informed me that there was a mess in the bathroom. I walked over to the boys' bathroom. Right outside the door was a mirror covered in feces, as if someone had drawn on it. I was furious. There was only an hour left in the day, and this happened. We usually ended the day in the computer lab with maybe only 20 kids left. I went to the lab and told all the boys, since it happened in the boys' restroom, to stand outside with their hands out. I walked down the line, checking each of their hands. The last child had the most disgusting smell. Not wanting to embarrass him, I instructed them all to go back inside the computer lab. Just as the kid before him went in, I pulled Vincent Van Shit aside. I'm sure he could see the anger on my face. I asked him in the calmest yet angriest tone, "Did you smear feces all over the mirror?" His eyes widened as he nodded. This child was the quiet, odd one but had never done anything in the past to make me suspect him. It was against our rules for us or the kids to clean bodily fluids or in this case solids. But I was so angry that I told him he would be the one cleaning it. At that very moment, his dad arrived to pick him up. I was nervous that the father would be upset with me. However, he was just as angry as I was when I explained the situation, and he agreed that his son would clean the mirror. Once the mirror was finally clean, one of the worst experiences of my life was over. The child ended up needing therapy. He was in 4th grade, and after the teachers heard what happened, they began to show much more concern for his well-being. I quit that job about a year later. Story 7. An elementary-age child attempted to poison her teacher over a few weeks by putting substances like bleach and other cleaners in the teacher's coffee. Later, it was discovered that she had been keeping a journal to track her actions. An internal investigation concluded that she did not intend to harm anyone, possibly influenced by her parents' tendency to be litigious. Ultimately, the teacher, faced with the prospect of having to keep the student in his classroom, decided to resign. Story 8. About 10 years ago, there was a girl in our school who was recruiting for human traffickers. I live in an area with good proximity to highways and many motels. The police informed us that this contributes to the area being a hotspot for trafficking. This young girl had a tragic story. She had been abused at home, her father eventually died from a drug overdose, and her mother struggled with severe mental health issues. Child and family services had been called to the family several times, but with little change. They were always struggling financially, but things deteriorated significantly after her father's overdose. When she reached high school, she became one of the students whom staff would take care of during Christmas. Teachers tried to be a bit more understanding. By the end of ninth grade, her attendance plummeted. She was very thin and unhealthy. However, in 10th grade, she returned looking better and coming to school, but she rarely attended classes. She had new clothes, a new phone, and was picked up and dropped off daily by her stepdad. Soon, she gathered a following of other students who began to exhibit attendance and behavior problems. It was apparent that it was becoming a serious issue. The school contacted Child and Family Services and the police with their concerns, but nothing ever came of it. It wasn't until one of her recruits attempted suicide that action finally began to unfold. Even then, it wasn't until she was in 12th grade that we were able to expel her. She was arrested several times and is currently in the system, but I suspect that when she gets out, she will return to her old ways. Story 9. I heard a story a few weeks ago from 8th graders. One girl was talking about her friend who got pregnant by a baby daddy. Both the soon-to-be mom and dad are 8th graders as well. The girls were planning to throw a baby shower and were excited about it. Story 10. I had a student in the elementary behavioral unit classroom who would create traps in the room. Throughout the day, he would intentionally place scissors and other things that could be used as weapons, move heavy furniture near the door, and eventually block the door with that furniture. This way, when he decided to attack, people could not enter to help or would be significantly slowed down in responding. Story 11. My niece is a teacher, and last week she told me that one of her students, who has severe learning disabilities and emotional outbursts, constantly soils his pants, punches everyone, including her, and disrupts the entire class all day long. No one learns anything because her attention is primarily focused on this one child. We live in Florida, and this is the current situation. The father told her, "Don't ever call me at my work again about my child. It's your job to supervise him for the day." This is one of the reasons American students are struggling. There used to be special classrooms for students with emotional, autistic, or disruptive behaviors, but now they are placed with the other children to avoid singling them out. Story 12. I worked in a private elementary school for a few years as a teaching assistant. There was a little boy in 1st grade who had a darker demeanor. One day, we were writing descriptive sentences. All the children were writing about blue water or brown puppies. This boy wrote about his red park. The park was red from the blood of his friends. I am not speculating. That is what he told me. The children were asked to draw a picture of their story. So he had drawn knives on swings and an axe covered in blood. This boy genuinely scared me. He was smaller than the other 1st graders, but had a very high intelligence quotient. He used to stalk and hunt other children on the playground. He would run, tackle, and bite them. Since I was a teaching assistant, I had to be outside with him and always had to run and save the other children. We had a meeting with his mother. She explained that he had 2 older brothers, ages 18 and 16. When he came home from school, he would play mature-rated video games with his father and brothers. His father also took him hunting most weekends. He finished the school year but was not invited back. It has been 11 years, and I always wonder what type of adult he has turned out to be. Story 13. I am not a teacher, but a high school student locally assaulted, raped, and murdered a teacher before placing her body in a trash barrel and wheeling it into the woods. This event deserves recognition. Story 14. There was a group of friends, all tween and teen boys. They were a little rambunctious, but no big deal. They were sweet kids who liked coming to talk to me about whatever. At one point, we were discussing their futures, and I shared some general life advice along the lines of, if you're in a conflict and feeling heated, and you think what you want to do or say will give you immediate relief, sleep on it. Give yourself time to think it through. One of those boys went on to murder a man in the heat of the moment at age 18. He received a life sentence. I had many feelings when I saw him in the news. I still envisioned the sweet boy who would go out of his way to wave and smile at me through the classroom door. But he was a man now, someone who did something profoundly terrible, something that can't be undone. We are all capable of horrible things. He will never experience any of the beautiful moments that accompany adulthood. Because of him, a woman will be without her husband, and children will be fatherless. I also worked with children with various types of disabilities. Some had behavioral issues so severe that they moved in and out of different systems. One child had profound mental illnesses and would tell me about things he'd done, like setting his head on fire to get the demons out. He always wore a beanie to cover his burn marks. I found that children were very open about their diagnoses and histories. They shared everything unprompted. They simply wanted someone to listen. Among all the things I heard, the demon aspect particularly stood out to me. Story 15. A 10-year-old boy was kicking another child's head. He was twice the size of the other child, and I couldn't physically stop him. Another child pulled down his mask during the pandemic and spat, more like a fountain spraying spit, halfway across the entire classroom. There was also a child who threatened to kill me because I told him he couldn't write his test in red ink. Story 16. A student begged me not to tell his mother that he forgot his book. He was almost in tears. He had a generic fantasy fiction book from the library. As he was walking out of class, I said, "Hey, don't forget your book," pointing to the book he had placed on the chalk ledge behind his seat to have more room to do his work. Like many 13-year-olds, he forgot it. This led to a meltdown. Story 17. Okay, so I'm not a teacher, but my mom is, so here's a disturbing story. Let's call this little 11-year-old girl Emily. Emily is in my mom's class where she teaches literature, history, and drama. After 2 days of her being a member of the class, the boys were complaining about her being very odd. At first, my mom didn't take it seriously. It wasn't her first time managing a class. However, as time went on, it became clear that something was very wrong with this little girl. Initially, it was just her obsession with washing her hands. She would hysterically wash them when someone touched her and went ballistic whenever a boy touched any of her belongings. Then the panic attacks began. Whenever something didn't go as she planned, like accidentally being locked out of the classroom by the cleaning lady, forgetting her keys, or missing the bus home, she would have these frightening panic attacks, sometimes threatening to hurt herself to get her way. My mom, being a responsible teacher, consulted with Emily's mother, who was also her colleague, and the school therapist to discuss Emily's problems, hoping for a change in behavior. After spending some time in therapy, it turned out that Emily was being abused at home by her stepfather and stepbrothers, and she believed there was a portal under her bed. Armed with this information, my mom talked to Emily's mother, who denied everything and claimed that her daughter was just an attention-seeking child who couldn't behave. Then, last month, Emily changed drastically. She refused to act like a normal human. All she did was meow and hiss at people, asking boys to be her owner. One time, a little boy said no to the ownership, and she scratched his face so hard that he needed stitches. My mom arranged another meeting, this time with the principal, Child Protective Services, the therapist, and the parents. Child Protective Services advised them to take Emily to a psychiatric ward because she tended to harm herself and others, had hallucinations, and experienced regular panic attacks. The next day, Emily approached my mom and asked, "Miss Lizzie, is it true that you wish me to die?" It turned out that the parents had told Emily after the conference that my mom wished her to die because Miss Lizzie wanted to send her to the psychiatric ward, and everyone knows there are flesh-eating germs there. Things continued to escalate. They somehow received a report claiming that Emily only had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and some dyslexia, which was clearly not the case. But last week was something different. After a boy accidentally bumped into her, she went ballistic, beat him up, and shouted, "I'll bring in my stepfather's gun and shoot you all dead." In my country, it is strictly prohibited to have a gun. When my mom asked the parents about it, they reassured her that they keep the bullets separately from the gun. Story 18. A 5-year-old girl was sexually assaulted by a group of 5-year-old boys, and the teachers did not report it. She had blood coming down her legs. They just wiped it off and sent her home. Story 19. Last week, At an elementary school near my home, a second-grade student bullied a classmate and punched him in the chest several times. When the teacher tried to intervene and remove the bully, he kicked her hand, breaking 2 of her fingers. Today's children lack basic manners. Story 20. I have encountered several troubling incidents involving students. One student placed a used tampon in their mouth and engaged in inappropriate behavior during their period. Another student applied a topical medication in the bathroom and returned to the classroom with remnants on their fingers. There was an incident where students soiled their pants and placed the soiled clothing in their backpack, which I discovered while retrieving a textbook. Additionally, a student had a severe breakdown and damaged a bathroom by removing a toilet and sink from the wall. Furthermore, there was a serious incident involving a senior and a minor. Finally, one student recklessly drove his car down a path by a body of water and ended up in it. Story 21. A student placed 5 tabs of LSD in a teacher's coffee. She experienced a complete mental breakdown and ceased teaching indefinitely. Story 22. Not sure if this is common globally, but in the Philippines, we occasionally experience mass demonic possessions in schools. By occasionally, I mean about once every 3 years. And this has been happening as long as I can remember. It usually begins with one student entering hysteria, followed shortly by others. We are largely Roman Catholics, and the first order of relief is always a priest, which makes the situation feel much more real. I believe many of these possessions are more psychological than supernatural, but when you witness it happening in front of you, as I have, it's hard to believe that a normal student can transform into a beast-like, rage-filled incarnation. Story 23. During my first practicum, a second grader pinned the secretary against the wall with a chair and shoved another student's head into the wall. Story 24. I am not a teacher, but this happened when I was in high school. I have explained this story a few times, but it keeps getting overlooked. When I was a freshman, I was in a science class when 2 girls burst in, fighting. To cut a long story short, they broke some glassware and used the broken pieces as weapons. The teacher, whom we referred to as Poppins because she reminded us of Mary Poppins, simply grabbed the 2 girls and dragged them to the nearest vice principal's office. Yes, the teacher did get injured by the glass fragments. However, the teacher returned, bandaged up, and resumed her lesson as if nothing had happened after we cleaned up the mess. Of course, we didn't want to wait for the custodial staff to show up. I knew one of the fighters and managed to catch up with her later. She and the other girl were suspended for fighting and had to pay for the damaged equipment. The girl I spoke with was originally from Los Angeles and had moved to my area shortly after the Los Angeles riots when she was a child. I assumed it had something to do with the riots, but I didn't ask. It felt too personal. I still think about it even 2 decades later. Story 25. Not a teacher, but when I was in middle school, a student threatened our geography teacher after receiving a bad grade. A few days later, he brought knives to school, but several students saw him and reported it. When some teachers searched his bag, no knives were found. It turned out he heard someone snitched and had thrown the knives out the girl's bathroom window. He confessed to this only when he was left alone with the geography teacher and then told her to follow him to show her where the knives were. Luckily, our English teacher overheard and called others to follow them, or who knows what that student might have done. They expelled him after that, but the last thing he told the geography teacher was, "You will dream about me." Story 26. As a student teacher, there was one student in the 3rd grade who frequently got in trouble and would not hesitate to express that he would harm you if you angered him. Years later, as a high school student, he attacked and killed his teacher. Story 27. During my last year as a high school teacher, a student stabbed another in the stomach area with a pen in my classroom while I was writing on the board. They started throwing punches, and I had to tackle the attacker to stop it, although it did not fully end the altercation. When the administration interviewed the attacker with me present, he claimed that he slipped and fell, stating it was a total accident, which we all knew was a lie and affected how we could assign repercussions. Later, during an Instagram live session, he talked about how he acted purely out of malice, claiming that the victim was a teacher's pet who deserved a lesson. He was suspended for 5 days and then returned to our class. This is the same student who had previously sold drugs on school grounds and would tell girls they needed to dress more provocatively and use cocaine on multiple occasions. The victim was crying more from the fear of being yelled at or hurt by his father for being involved in a fight. He was truly one of the sweetest students I ever had, always asking how he could learn more, even during breaks. Story 28. Just as a fun anecdote, I want to clarify that I am not a teacher. During roll call in high school, Ms. C stopped at the young man sitting next to me, Greg P. She began telling stories about his older brothers. To encourage students to use more vivid language, she required them to write about crises they faced, with one paper due each semester. Stress leads to cortisol, which enhances memory, and she aimed to ensure we all had a good chance to succeed. Greg's oldest brother entertained her by writing about being mauled by a bear. However, he also disturbed her by dropping his trousers in class. Ms. C insisted that the stories must be true, and although she acknowledged it was good writing, she did not believe it was real and allowed him to resubmit. Greg's next oldest brother took inspiration from the previous one by writing about a hunting accident involving an arrow ricocheting into his eye and the long, bumpy ride to the hospital. She also asked him to resubmit after finding it unbelievable. He further disturbed her by removing his glass eye. "So what's your story, Greg?" she asked. "No hunting accidents here, ma'am," he replied. She then made him switch seats to the furthest possible position from the paper cutter. I ended up sitting next to someone else for the rest of that semester. Story 29. When I was in grade school, I was transferred to a class with all of the troublemakers and juvenile delinquents. I have no idea why, as I never got in any trouble. In that class, I was subjected to various forms of abuse and was beaten up a couple of times on the playground by my classmates. This lasted an entire semester, and I was very miserable. But the next semester, I was placed in a regular class. I wish I had asked why I was in the same class as those troublemakers. But given how much time has passed, I guess I will never know. Story 30. Years ago, I had a highly dysregulated middle school student. He was disruptive in class and performing well below grade level. He would do things like grab the back of the bus and slide along behind it for fun when it snowed. One Monday in September, he was suspended for assault, and I, the young teacher, went to his house to drop off a package of work for him to complete. I handed it to his mother at the door, who declined it, saying, "No, no, no. I'm going to give him the rest of the week off as a little vacation." A few months later, while on yard duty, I heard him shout the name of one of his female classmates. She and I turned around at the same time, and he slapped her so hard that she fell to the ground. Then he laughed. I brought both of them into the office, and he was taken straight to the principal's office while she sat on the bench with ice on her nose, moaning. It turned out her nose was broken and severely misshaped. The police arrived, as protocol required, without calling the parents. With the principal present, due to his history, they took him away in handcuffs. On the way out the door, he managed to shake them off and tried to run home. His history warranted the use of handcuffs in the first place. Even with the handcuffs, he shook them off and attempted to flee. I knew his mother would have hidden him until the police left, then gotten him somewhere else they couldn't find him. Eventually, he was found guilty of assault, and she could never get her nose straightened again. Down the road, he was killed with a bullet to the back of his head, coincidentally on the sidewalk outside my friend's place. He had been dealing drugs for the wrong people, or so the rumor went. He had no money to his name, and his mother had to hold a fundraiser for his funeral. I regret to say that I believe the world was a better place without him because, out of the 2,000 students I have taught, he was the only one I ever felt might commit murder as an adult. Though I'm ashamed to admit it. Story 31. I had a student slap me as a dare in front of his friends. He was 17 and a senior. The school pressed charges, but he received only probation. I had to leave the school the following year for safety reasons. Story 32. We had this student in middle school, but the troubling events occurred when he turned 18. When we had him, he was a general troublemaker, nothing too serious or indicative of his future. His mother made excuses for him constantly. She obtained a 504 plan because he struggled to organize himself as a 12-year-old, among other issues. Any misbehavior, such as excessive talking in class or disrupting lessons with his antics, was often attributed to his diagnosis. There was one day when his mother exited her vehicle and marched into the school. When the teachers at the door stopped her, she demanded to be let inside, insisting, "He has a 504 plan." Why? Her son had forgotten his schoolwork, and she was going to retrieve it. The disturbing act he committed years later: he kidnapped a 15-year-old boy, brought him back to his apartment, and proceeded to beat him, threatening him with a knife and a gun. There were 2 other boys involved, but he was the leader, being 18 while the others were 16. It was shocking to open a web browser and see this as the major news story of the day. Story 33. My first teaching experience was at a charter school in a very impoverished area. My students often lived with their grandparents or other family members because their parents were frequently incarcerated. One thing I heard was that some parents had been incarcerated for robbing a funeral home for formaldehyde to smoke. I didn't even know that was a thing. I often heard many sad stories from students, and there were numerous behavioral and organizational issues. I am pretty sure the administration was using the school for money laundering, and it seemed like a lot of people knew this. As for the most disturbing thing a child has ever done, I was in a 2nd grade classroom helping to support the teacher so she could get some work done during indoor recess because the weather was bad. The biggest troublemaker in the class wanted to go to the bathroom. The bathroom next to the classroom was only a single-stall restroom, so I took him there and waited outside. After a couple of minutes, I started getting worried because he was still in there. Eventually, I had to knock on the door to ask if he was okay. There was no response. I had to escalate the situation and involve superiors. They had to call the janitor to open the door. When they did, they found the student and the entire restroom covered in feces, his feces. He had literally been in there smearing it all over the restroom and himself. At the time, it was horrifyingly gross for me, but what made it worse was learning that children at this age who exhibit this behavior are likely being sexually abused. It was a horrible situation, and the school did nothing to help the students, purely for financial gain. I left teaching shortly thereafter. Story 34. During 7th grade, I noticed that when a student stood up from his seat, he would enter a different state. He began to moan, rolled his eyes back, and shook his lower body as if he were mimicking dancing. A few moments later, he started screaming uncontrollably. Story 35. It's not disturbing, but rather funny. When I went to teach 2nd grade as part of my student teaching during my last year of school, a student approached me with a piece of paper and asked, "Can you give me your number?" I was shocked. He kept coming back, and I spent the whole day trying to avoid him. Story 36. Not a teacher, but in high school, there was a student who sneaked up behind another student he apparently had a conflict with and smashed a glass bottle over his head. Blood was everywhere. I was about 10 feet in front of this, and I will never forget that shattering sound. I never saw the perpetrator after that. Story 37. He shoved his hands down the front of another younger child's pants on the bus when he was in 1st grade. I wasn't a mandated reporter at the time and only heard of the incident secondhand. However, I worry about what his home life was like. He seemed exceptionally knowledgeable about sex for a 6-year-old. He would be about 22 now. Story 38. A high school student set fire to the booklet inside the classroom on my first day teaching that class, and then they loosened all the wheel bolts on my car. Story 39. I'm not a teacher, but my classmates have done some pretty disturbing things, including trying to find out a teacher's address. For context, this teacher was picked on and talked about by the other kids because he was a short, plump guy, but going as far as asking for his address? I also overheard one kid make fun of a homeless person while on the bus to a field trip. I wanted to scream at her in that moment. Story 40. I had a 14-year-old autistic student hold a chair above their head to throw at me while I was 8 months pregnant. I managed to calmly reach out and hold one of the legs to bring it down. Later, they made a shiv out of a can and tried to stab another student. Story 41. My mother is a 3rd grade teacher. One of her students climbed into the ceiling from the bathroom. That same student hacked a national children's news website that year. Story 42. I had a student yesterday who got upset because she thought the girl behind her was sitting too close, even though they were 4 feet apart. When I told her I wasn't moving her and that she needed to get over it, she went back to her desk and cut all her hair off. 4th grade. Story 43. I worked as a reading teacher and general teaching assistant at an elementary Montessori school. The founder and head teacher of the older students, aged 10 to 14, ended up in jail after being accused of inappropriate behavior with some of the younger girls. I left a few months before this came to light. He was cleared, as far as I remember. My memory of him is mostly of his inappropriate anger towards children and staff when things didn't go his way. Later, I learned that there was also an older child, a 10-year-old boy who was much larger than the others, who was cornering some of the younger, smaller boys, aged 4 to 5, and touching them inappropriately. The owner and founder knew about this and chose to ignore it because the perpetrator had family issues. He lived with his grandfather, his parents were not in the picture, and he stayed late every day because no one came to pick him up. I mention his size because I remember him being physical and angry often, and I was frightened for my safety on more than one occasion, as he was strong enough to easily overpower me. Story 44. A child told me she saw a vision of someone shooting up the school. She reported this to the counselor, saying her intuition indicated it would happen the next day. They refused to suspend her because she technically wasn't making a threat. She brought a knife to school the following day and showed it to a friend. The friend alerted me, and I said that if she wasn't removed, I would quit. She was suspended, and they found plans to harm others in the school. I ultimately decided to resign. Story 45. I haven't had anything extremely bad happen yet, and I'm not a teacher. However, I am a middle school student. I doubt my school would expel anyone. There is a student who has been sending threats to my dad's friend's son's cousin. I think he is still there and everyone is aware of it, but the principal won't take action. The cousin did attend another middle school in the district at the beginning of the year, but it didn't work out. My parents don't know everything about my school yet, and I think I should tell them. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.